Welcome everybody. We're not going to use the PA system today because again it does this womp 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 like yesterday. So if you want to hear me, you're probably going to have to come a little bit closer. I'm not going to be screaming and there's room up here. So go ahead. This morning it's about Angularjs. And let me just quickly see who's created something productive with Angularjs in the audience.
Not yet.
Okay, so that's about 4 or 5. Who's tried using it? Well, at least a few more. So that means we have a lot of people in here that probably either have not used it or got scared pretty quickly when they started looking at it. And that's totally okay. 2 years ago, or about 3 years ago, when I first wanted to use Angularjs, I looked at it and there was almost no documentation. And the tutorial started with, this is how you set up a testing environment. And I was like, nah, this can't be real. So I left it at that, tried Knockout.js. Then we did a very large project for a customer in Knockout, and we ran into a lot of trouble. Simply because Knockout is just too simple. It does data binding, but not much more. We finished the project, but we had to, do it a bit the nasty way. And then later on, we moved to Angularjs, and things got a lot easier. So what also happened, though, is they improved the documentation a lot. But Angular is a very moving target. Now, a while ago on the websites, you would say, okay, JavaScript is not a good idea anyways because we need pages that are indexed by Google. But if you just read my blog from last week, this is the reality. Google indexes rendered JavaScript. And it goes very far. So even if you'd have like drop-downs where the selection in the drop-down would cause a link or a redirect to happen, Google will index that. If you have a link which happens on a mouse move, Google will index that. If you generate HTML with a nofollow, Google will not index that. If you generate HTML with a picture in it, Google will index that. So in other words, JavaScript and Google have come a long way. So I'm glad that you're all here to listen to a little bit about Angularjs. And what I really want to teach you here is that it can be fairly simple. But one of the core reasons it sometimes is not simple is if you go online and research a question, you're going to find some kind of an answer, and that answer could work, but it may be a stupid idea. And I basically had to relearn Angularjs about 3 times until I got to where I am here. And we're the developers of Too Sexy Content, and whenever we create apps and things like that, we're always under the pressure that if we release something, it has to be almost perfect because we know people are just going to copy it, modify 2 words, and then release it again. And then suddenly you have something in the wild which sucks if we didn't start the chain the right way. So here's just a little bit of an example code of how you shouldn't do it, because I wanted to show you that even the official Angularjs documentation, this is the step 5 in their getting started tutorial, has things in it which you should not do. The one thing which is currently regarded as not a good idea anymore is creating a controller which uses $scope. Now, and for those 6 or so that have worked with Angular, I bet your controller does actually use that, and that's because that's the way the current documentation is built. But it's a bad idea. But everybody else that doesn't understand that, don't worry about it. I just wanted to point out, start with understanding the principles, which I'll try to give most of them to you today. And built on that, it'll get very easy. So what are we going to do? I'm going to show you a short demo, get a little bit into what it is, and then I'll actually dive into the demo and show you more about it, because you can download the demo later on. It's actually already online. And so I've actually commented a lot in there too, because I really want people to learn it the right way. So let's look at the demo. It's a fairly simple app. I'm currently here on a page. I'm using Internet Explorer. This demo here, I'm not logged on. This is an important factor because I'm using the REST API of Too Sexy, which is actually security protected, but I'm not logged on. It still works. So usually when I do a test or something, I just type in like the time or something just to be sure that what I see in the result is the current one. So this is just a simple feedback form, very trivial. And it very briefly showed that it was sending, and now it's gone. On the other side, I have an admin UI, which looks like it's this page here I called Manage. It's in the same app. And this just retrieves a list of all the items, shows them to me. I can do things like, oh, this one's still new, I'm going to complete it now. Or actually, I'm going to delete it. And here's a toggle functionality, also very trivial. I will delete this one too. Or maybe I would like to modify this and just do something, and everything happens very quickly and very simply. This is a very simple AngularJS application, but you do see it doesn't feel like the old postback scenarios we're used to from almost all other cases. And this is what we're going to look at today. So basically, if you think of an Angular app, think of it as a module. But at least for the end user, things feel a lot easier. And we use AngularJS for image galleries, for tools like this, for just about anything, because we also know that one day we're not going to be using the current DNN, and we want whatever we do to still run then. And so if we just rely on some APIs, some REST calls, things get very easy. So I just wanted to show you the live demo. If you would like to download this, by the way, let me just tell you this. The internet connection here is terrible, but on toosexy.org/apps, you're going to find a lot of these apps. Some of them are for real use, some of them are more functionality demos, tutorials. So this too is an Angular app, by the way. That's why the catalog loaded a little late. And in here you're going to find the app which I'm demonstrating right now. So basically, when we're doing Angular, we want to really clear our separation of concerns. This is a very basic principle, but programmers love to break it because they start with something small and then they keep on adding things at that spot because it's very practical. But we're going to really say the server is actually rather a stupid machine. It's in charge of data and it's in charge of security. The app you just saw has zero app-specific server code. There's no code I had to write on the server for this app. It just does REST calls for reading, writing, etc. So there's absolutely no code. And the client is in charge of creating the UI. It's in charge of telling the server what it wants. And of course, does all the lists and the dialogues and messages. But the server shouldn't have to tell the client that it can now show the thank you message. That's the old way in ASP.NET, but it always caused a lot of trouble and a lot of messy things. So all the code that we wrote is on the client. And I'm going to now show you what is happening on the wire, because this is actually the important part. So here I got Fiddler open. There are various tools to do this, by the way, and I'll just mention this again in the presentation. You can also use the Chrome debugger or Firebug. I personally love Fiddler. It also allows you to repeat a certain request and modify it a little bit before you send it again, and various things like that. So let's look at this. Of course, there's a lot of systems running in the background, but let's just create another request. And I just reloaded the page, and what you will notice, there's already a first REST call here. And let me just try to zoom in on that for you. So that one is already calling the sorted categories from a query. So that's our first call. What happens in the background? Well, if I look at the result, I get a JSON back which contains some additional metadata, but basically it's the query items from the database just directly as I need them, these for the dropdown. And if I send something back, then too, let's look at what happened on the wire. It's again just a simple JSON call, a REST call to this. And the difference is, and this is the REST standard, this is a post to this address without an ID. If it would have an ID in the URL, it would try to do an update on the feedback number 17. But since it's just feedback, here's some data, we're sending this JSON on the wire, and of course it gets created by the server, and that's it. So that's what's happening on the wire. And if you're doing Angularjs or any other kind of client framework, you're going to be using such tools quite a bit, because when something breaks, you have to figure out, did it break before I sent it or before it arrived on the server, or where's my code going wrong? And looking at this helps you a lot. The same thing, of course, let me just go back to the admin UI here. Same thing, if I would do something like, let's toggle this to be completed, then I will have a call on this item here. I hope you can see it, but here I have an ID after the path feedback. And it is again sending ID this status completed, and it sets it, returns the same object again. And here's the follow-up call, because my application automatically refreshed the entire view just to be sure. Same thing with the delete. A delete to, by standards definition, is a real official, it's still just the same address. So I'm calling this address, but in my headers, I'm saying delete. And that's the way it should be done. So HTTP has the functionality to say I'm not getting something, I'm deleting something, and that's the way REST should work. Okay, so that's a bit on the background. Oh, yes, one more thing I wanted to show you. This is very important for DNN. Is the way DNN works is, there's probably Outlook or something trying to access something, is we always have to send security headers along in DNN for most cases. In this case, the REST API expects it, so we need to add header information about which module we're on, which tab we're on, and some security tokens. This is to protect our system that not external systems would create feedback items on our REST API. I mean, just because we allow external people to write something doesn't mean we want everybody to just be able to fill our database. So this ensures somebody has been on the page and really clicked on the send button. And I'll show you in the background how that is handled fully automatically. So standard REST call, special DNN headers, and basically doing all these kinds of operations. So let's look at the backend. This is not because we're interested in this at the moment, but because I want to give you a context of what is happening when you're seeing all these things. So in the backend, this is a very simple ToSexy app. Basically, we have for example here, the feedback items. This is just a simple content type with subject, status, category. And you'll also notice some fields I didn't show in my feedback form because I don't want to show it to the user. It also has permissions set on the content type because I want to allow a create for public users. Normally, if I would say I have a content type for a person, I don't want public people to be able to create this. In this case, I want it, but I only want to give them create permissions and no edit or read. So that's trivial. For the feedback category, for example, has permissions for reading for anonymous users because too, I don't want to just publish all the data. I want to explicitly say, yes, people are allowed to get the categories. And in this special case, just because I wanted to show a functionality, I wanted to make sure that the categories arrive on the client in a sorted way. I could, of course, do the sorting in JavaScript, but just for demo purposes, I created a visual query here. This is the sorted categories. And what you'll see is from the cache, it only gets the entities of a certain type, namely the feedback categories. And it'll then do a sort on them by title and deliver this to the target. So here I just took some data, did some kind of a query functionality on the server. And that's also why in the request on Fiddler, you'll see that this one goes to an app query because it doesn't go directly to the REST, it goes to that survey there, to that query there. Whereas the other ones will just go directly to, let me do a refresh on the list. This list here doesn't go to query, but it actually just goes to get me all the feedback. So this one says app content, give me feedback. So that's what's happening on the server. No code, REST calls all the security set up, but it's all just configuration based. I mean, basically, most web designers should be able to do this, and those that cannot do it should be able to at least modify it if they would like to have slightly different functionality. So what's Angular? Basically, I would just like to summarize and say it's a system to create JavaScript apps. From the people in here, let me just ask, who's used Knockout before? Okay, that's a lot more. And that's very typical, especially in a Microsoft-focused audience. For quite a while, Knockout was being promoted at various events, and of course it helped people get started, or to at least think, finally we have something that works. And it's the same thing. People like getting a demo that works, fiddling around with it a bit, and if somebody on stage shows that, it gets popular. Who has used other systems like Ember or something? So not Knockout, not Angular, but a JavaScript client-side framework. Okay, 1, 2. Okay, yeah, and even 3. Wow. But yeah, that's a very typical scenario now. Because 2 years ago, Microsoft promoted Knockout. Nobody talked about Angular. It was from the dark side, but that's changed a bit now. The great thing about creating all this stuff in JavaScript is that that's where the client is. You don't have to wait for the server to think of what to do. So it solves a bunch of things. Now, splitting up concerns is an important thing. Data binding, of course, is important. That's what you also do in Knockout. It also is in charge of communication with the server. Now, in Knockout, you would do that yourself. And it does a lot of more advanced things like view management or dependency injection. And especially the dependency injection is something we really need in DNN for it to work well, which I'll show you later on. What's also important is that it has a lot of patterns. I mean, if it's just a data binding framework like Knockout, you don't need to teach people a lot of patterns because it doesn't do much. But when you start creating a large application, you need to worry about architecture. You need to worry about, if I do it this way, will my coworker or anybody else, including me in 1 year, still understand this? So do it nicely, because the next guy that will have to look at this might be you. Has hit me a lot of times, and I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about. So let's split this thing into the functional blocks. This is based on the demo I just showed you. We have a feedback form, we have an admin form, and we have partial forms. I'll show you that in a moment. We can put forms inside forms. I did it more for the demo here because the application's too trivial, but it helps me to block my logic into certain components, separation of concerns. Then I have services. Services are basically in charge of data or other things. They're like special helpers. A service can get me my categories, can get me my feedback items, could also do things like a calculation service. A service doesn't have to communicate with a server. It's more or less just saying, here's some business logic to a topic, or here's some anything else which I can encapsulate nicely. And the controllers, we'll look at that in a moment. The term controller is slightly confusing because almost every MV whatever framework does it a little different. Basically, the controller is the constructor, the initializer of the application. But we'll look at that in a moment. And these are all just little files. Let me just quickly show you this. I have them open in a web matrix. Just for the demo, let me see if I can zoom in a bit. We'll look at the details in a moment, but here I have an HTML template doing some things. Here I have another one. And as you saw, I commented it a lot because I hope you guys will download this later on and benefit from it. We have services. Again, very simple things. Many of them are very, very small, but they serve their purpose. And all of this will be glued together by Angular.js when the browser loads the page. And then the block at the bottom, I hope you can see it. Yep. There's one special moment in Angular, and that's when we initialize it. Now, if yesterday you were at the presentation with the dependency injection, who saw that one? With the dependency injection and initializing the components? That's it. If you look at an application lifecycle, if you have special things you rely on, like if our Angular application needs DNN, then this should be done somewhere very early. so that it doesn't have to be handed through your code later on. And that's why, to do it really nicely, we need some special initialization and some helpers, and that will then help you keep the application very, very clean. And here's just a ultra trivial, complete AngularJS application, just to show you how trivial it can be. Because if you look at this top thing, I know a lot of people tried Knockout because they would look at an Angular demo and they would think, gosh, this is complicated. But in reality, it's just complicated because it does much more than just data binding. If all you care about is data binding, it doesn't get much harder than Knockout. You see here, simple template, 2 or 3 placeholders. This is a repeater. That's it. I mean, Knockout can't be easier than that. I mean, it isn't. And here's the separate JavaScript code, which is in charge of retrieving the data. Note there's no $scope. And in here, it just says, this is my initial message. Then it gets the data from the REST API. And when it's done, it'll adapt the message and pass the items back to the view model. So it's very easy. And I think even no matter where you're coming from, if you've developed for 1 or 2 years on almost any platform, this should not feel difficult. So I just wanted to give you a short answer to this right now, because this is a common question. First of all, jQuery is something that will become obsolete pretty soon. The reason is that jQuery is mainly solving browser incompatibilities. So in other words, if you want to do a selector on a DOM object, that used to be extremely difficult because every browser would do it differently. And some of them didn't even support it. So jQuery helped us with that. But basically the core things jQuery does are becoming unimportant because it does it by itself. Angular itself actually contains jQuery in a smaller edition. And they're saying that in a future version, they're going to remove it because it's not needed anymore. And Knockout has some comparabilities, of course, but it's just as long as it's only data binding. For everything else, it doesn't make sense to compare the two systems. It's like comparing an engine with a car. You can't say, well, one of them's bigger, the other one's smaller. It doesn't make much sense. So, and this is what we're trying to do. Very fast, nice, sexy Ajax web applications. And for me, also, it's very important to always remember, I'm working with DNN today, but I may not be working with it tomorrow. We do a lot on SharePoint. AngularJS and SharePoint work really well together. It's a lot of fun. We will do SharePoint projects and people will be like, oh my goodness, this is possible in SharePoint. But they don't realize, of course, that they're seeing an Angular application. And even one day you will be leaving this DNN for the next DNN. Well, it's good to build it in a way that you don't rely on the current specs. So keep it that way. And then there's also one thing I'm very passionate about is getting rid of the code on the server. I believe almost every DNN developer, once upon a time, tried hosting multiple customers on one DNN installation. Who's tried that? Come on, come on, come on, come on. There we go. It was terrible, wasn't it? And one of the main reasons why it was terrible is because you would have some module installed for customer A, and because of customer B, you would have to upgrade it, and it would break customer A because it would share the DLL and things like that. So you'd have a system which is technically multi-client capable, could technically host 10,000 customers on one single installation. Awesome. But you can't, because anything you do is going to have side effects and break your system. But if you can create applications which have no server-side code, you can host those 10,000 users on one system, because if the server only runs tokens or only runs simple REST calls, then every client can have his special gallery and his special feedback form and even his special job listings app, and it doesn't hurt. So that's also why we're always so focused on telling people how they can use tokens in 2Sexy, because it's great for low-skill developers and it's great for security and stability. And of course, if it's not enough, I'm certain just create your own web API, but then you do have your security implications. And of course, our vision also includes the fact that if Google can index JavaScript applications, there's very little reason to muck about with doing this stuff on the server. So let's look at some separation of concerns. This is just a short thing. Split yourself into small components, because as you add functionality later on, they will get a little bigger, and people like not working on the architecture again later on. So it helps you a lot, but don't overdo it. So if you just have a single liner, outsourcing that isn't going to be much help. You'll see later on in the best practices for AngularJS, there's actually this concept of starting with a clean, trivial structure that could grow into a very complex structure through very simple refactoring. So if your initial structure is trivial, but in a way that you can easily refactor it, then you don't have to start with a 20-folder initialization system. Okay, and spend more time on figuring out how things work together, less on coding. So, and this is where I just wanted to call out to you briefly. This is not about AngularJS, but it's actually about the community and open source. We're investing a lot of time creating such demos, creating all these kind of solutions, and just publishing them out there. But there's just so many topics to cover for designers, for developers, for people who are trying to structure special car optimized websites, whatever. And we just can't do it all. So I just want to ask you guys, if anybody of you would like to help, be it with localization, for translating the UI, if somebody of you is passionate about a different JavaScript framework and would love to implement it on 2Sexy, please come forward to me afterwards. If you would like to help write blogs, a little bit of documentation, we just need your help. And we're doing all of this for free, and it would just be very appreciated if you would do that too. Just a little bit, an hour a week or something would be great. Okay, that was the advertisement in between. Let's look at the views and best practices. So I'm going to first show you the template for new feedback. So that is this one. And I'll just show you a few things about it, especially because I'm assuming most of you are not familiar yet with Angular. So, sorry about that. Here, is the code readable back there? I'm just asking because I'm just going to guess a little bit here. So, for example, we have something here called an ng switch. Feels familiar, right? So we're saying something like, do a switch on the view models show information, and by default, show this section. And if the show is currently set to sending, it'll show this part, and otherwise it'll show this part. Very simple. This here, by the way, is a server-side token, which is replaced by the current language's message in the server resources. So that's just a trivial server-side thing. So of course the client gets a real text here when he loads the page. So that's a switch. Then we have something like in here. Here is a input field which is bound to the view model's item subject property. Here is a dropdown which more or less says build the options here using the ID and the title in the categories in the view model. Simple, no big deal. And it is bound to this property. So of course, this thing here tells the browser what's the list to create. And this thing here will tell it whatever's selected, where does it go into my current item. Again, very simple. And here's one more input field bound to the message. And the rest is just a simple div construction, and that's it. So all of you can do that. One important thing, and this is where the $scope comes in, is here it says use the controller new and please call it VM. I could give it a different name and use a different name in the part below. That's very important because I have many cases where I have multiple controllers on one screen, and then I need these names to keep them apart. What else do we have? Here it just says this is this app, And here's something included which will give it the module ID. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. That has to do with the security implications in our REST calls coming up. So that's more or less it for the view. I can give any web designer this to modify, to update. It's easy. So what do we have? We have a bunch of things like show hide and things like that. These are called directives in AngularJS. The reason is it's a little bit like a tag helper or something in ASP.NET in the new version. This is just a command which has been registered to work, and Angular has a whole set that just work out of the box, and you can create your own as well. And of course, if you'll see, I completely separated the data binding of the core information, which is this viewModel.item, and I'm keeping it separate from the viewModel.categories. The reason is my item should look really nice, so I can just, without even changing it, send it to the server. So I'm trying to keep my item in the same object structure like the server will expect to receive it, or the way he would have sent it to me. So I'm keeping these things very separate, and this makes life much easier. So simple stuff is trivial. And here's the thing that maybe a lot of you don't know. Do you guys know how a knockout knows that something changes? Those that work with knockout would probably know this, right? Yeah, observable. It uses observables. Anybody use that or understand the concept? Anybody want to say something about it quickly? Come on, somebody. You knockouters.
Yeah, it's a dual binding. You change something, you change the variable, it automatically updates the view, or if you change the view, it automatically updates the variables behind it.
Yep, but there's an important complication to it. Yeah.
And the real challenge is that if you build a big model, it's every time one observable changes, it has to do an update. And if you have a model that has lots of dependencies back and forth from the view to the model, then you can get into it. It can take a long time sometimes.
That is an issue, but I think those that don't know it yet will probably not understand the issue yet. So let me quickly show you something. If we look at one of my controller codes here, let me just look at something. I can do, for example, here on the view model, I would say item.category.id has a new value. And in Knockout, I could not write it that way, because Knockout would not know that the value has changed, and it would not update the screen. In Knockout, I would have to do something like here, new value, something like that, because in Knockout I have to change every property to be a special JavaScript object, which will tell the system in the background, oh, I've been updated, and you can now do whatever kind of changes that happened. And the funny thing is, if you look at that the first time, you think, oh, the code is kind of nasty, but it sounds like a reasonable idea. In reality, it has lots of side effects. That's what Charles was trying to say. We created, for example, a help application. It's a bit like an FAQ. And we'd have this where people would be able to type into the input box. And when they type, of course, the list should change automatically. Now, if you use observables and every single change tells the system in the background, oh, by the way, I've changed, please start rebinding the screen. Then when you do small changes which have effects on many objects, you're rebinding a lot. So we would have the problem, you'd type a key, and because he would touch every object in the background, it would like take 1 to 2 seconds to build up the screen again. And that on every single click, which would almost freeze your application. There's ways to work around it in Knockout. We figured those out too, but it's not nice. Angular does it differently. Angular actually keeps a copy of your entire view model hidden somewhere. And there's certain moments, I will explain that a bit later, where Angular just knows, okay, probably this is a case where typically data would change. For example, if I had a user interaction like a click, that's a common case where data changes. Let me quickly compare my background data with my foreground data, and if anything changed, let me quickly rebind it. And when you hear that the first time, you're like, this doesn't sound like a good idea. This must be extremely inefficient, but it's not at all. It's actually very, very fast. But if you're doing some other thing, where Angular doesn't know that the data changed, you'll have to inform it of that. But you usually don't have to do that if you work with nice best practices. So that was just a background information. Probably if you start playing with it, you won't realize it because things just work. But one day you'll ask yourself, why did it not update? And then you'll have to research the digest cycle in Angular. So some best practices here. Very simple stuff. Just do it the way you want. And just two things I wanted to mention is when you do your next drop-down binding, there's many ways you can do it. There's about 7 different ways you can do a drop-down binding, and just read yourself into that when you do it the first time. And for anything advanced, keep your concerns separated. And use the controller as syntax. Then, yeah, try to work with the visual model, view model item, just like the rest would deliver or take it back. And the module ID, that's the important thing, which we'll look at later on. This is the only place where you should use the module ID. Let's look at the controller. The controller, again, initializes the view model. The way I understand MVC on the server, that's not quite the same thing. It also does a bit more. But here, what actually happens is the controller, if you look at my code here, will say, okay, I have a new view model. It'll do some things, and if you look at it here, for example, it'll also tell the view model, if you want to save, this is the code you will be using. Now, after running this, the controller is actually not used anymore. It's really more like a constructor for a view model, and that means when I do click save, it's going to execute this code, of course, but it doesn't have anything to do with the controller anymore. The controller is really just kind of an initializer. And that's important to understand because you always everybody has a different idea what a controller could be. And just understanding it's just more or less your view model constructor helps you put it all into scope. So what do we have here? First of all, the VM equals this. This is probably the most important thing to understand to go ahead and not copy the mistakes from everybody else, because this VM equals this is the requirement to be able to then use this syntax here. So if you start with this code anyways, don't worry too much about what I said. But if you ever see things that start with new controller $scope like that, then they're not doing it that way. That's the old way. But you'll find a lot of examples that do it that way. And anybody here that has done that will think, well, it kind of works, so why bother? But if you do it this way, trust me, there's like 80% of all the bugs that you'll have to do with that. So keeping this away is the clean way to do it. Just requires you to use VM equals this. And again, the name itself is not important. I could write Johnny here and I could write VM here. It would still work. So those names don't have to match. This is just a common convention. Okay, exactly. It should do initialization and nothing else. Do not use the scope. And I know that you will probably use the scope after a while because that's all the examples are that way. But trust me, I mean, have you ever started writing some static methods in C# and then they have to call another method and you end up making that one static as well because...
Chain reaction.
Yeah, you keep on changing another thing because of that, and one day your code has 50% static methods and you're thinking, gosh, I don't get it anymore. Yeah, that'll happen to you, so just avoid it. Now, what you'll also see is I'm not accessing any DNN internal stuff, and I'm not using the module ID in the controller. So if you look at other DNN-based solutions, you'll have things where the controller actually will first load the attributes from the main tag. That's a very common practice and it's a bad one. Most people will try to get the module ID or something out of this tag in the controller, but the controller does not need the module ID. The controller doesn't do server communication, so why should it bother? But that's the cheap way to do it. I want to show you later on, don't do it that way because your code just stays much cleaner. And I'll show you later on how. Okay. So let's look at a service. If we look at the feedback services here, let's look at a very simple one. This is my category service, and all it does, it has one method, get, very difficult, and it does $HTTP get, this. Who knows what $HTTP is? Go ahead.
It's equivalent to, I guess, jQuery Ajax, only returns a promise.
Yep. So it does it's an Ajax call, more or less. And it doesn't return the result, because for that, of course, you'd have to wait till the call is through. But it returns a promise object, which is something that will contain the result once it gets back. So it's very, very simple. And so just by calling this call here, it will take care of everything for me. Now here too, you will see no module ID, nothing. But when I run this one line of code, everything in the background will happen. You'll also notice that the path isn't complicated here. It's very trivial. It's just get me the sorted categories from the query. So we've reconfigured $HTTP to automatically take care of all the DNN specials. And that's the way it should be. That's dependency injection. The most examples you'll find out there have a lot of code before this call trying to get the correct URL, trying to add the correct headers and all that kind of stuff, but that's just not the sexy way to do it. This should stay very simple. This is just the categories. That's it. If the hosting environment has special requirements, the service shouldn't have to know that. So it's in charge of data or anything else. It can get data, do things like that. It can also keep track of things. I will show you a little example of this right over here. Here's my feedback service. And this one too has things like get, add, update, get a new blank feedback item, has a delete. And then I wanted to show you a special technique here where the service itself actually keeps a list of all feedback items. And this is where Angular gets really powerful, because in my code here, let me show you the control. So the review feedback, of course, is very classic as well, a bit of HTML, some buttons, things like that. And the controller of the admin UI is that. That's the controller for the entire thing, which has all those buttons for that. That's all the JavaScript code which is special for this view. And basically what it says here is that it's going to bind itself to the service. So the view model's feedback property is bound to the feedback service and to the live list in the feedback service. This has a really cool consequence that I don't have to do any more update calls inside my controller. The moment that list changes, my entire view is going to change. And so the way it's done is that the feedback service, as I said, keeps an internal variable. It's an array of all the feedback items. And now the one important thing you have to know is I'm never allowed to delete this object and replace it. If I would do that, then all previous references to it would reference the other now missing object. But if I clean the list and repopulate it, then anything bound to it is still going to be bound to it. And that's what I'm doing here. So if you don't understand it, mess around with it a little bit, you'll figure it out. But it's a very cool mechanism to just separate your concerns again. Let your service take care of the data. Let your data binding, which is given by Angular, take care of all the visualization. All the controller has to do is say, map these two things, and everything takes care of itself. And thanks to this, for example, the controller can do things like review or delete or something like that. Where is that? And whenever these things here, for example, here it just says, when you do a delete, just map that to the delete action of the service. And there's no more, and please remember after delete, refresh your list, blah, 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 blah. It's just mapping a few things, and that's it. And that's what the controller should do. Initialize, and then let everything else take over. So create a service for each purpose. Again, don't handle DNN or any environment specials at your service level. I want to be able to take this app and move it to SharePoint, and ideally not change a single line of code. And then also run it on Umbraco, or the next version of DNN, or Drupal, and not have to rewrite my code. If we go this way, then also you will be able to benefit from other open source apps made out there where the guy actually thought he was doing it for WordPress. And you'll be able to take it, at best change 1 or 2 initialization parameters, and run it almost one-to-one on your DNN environment. Okay, the $HTTP will be using dependency injection. We'll look at that in a moment, which is about now. Okay, there's one very thing I wanted to mention to you, and this is we've been talking, or you've probably heard people talk about spas. And in my opinion, that's the wrong way of looking at the world. If you talk about a spa, which is a single page application, the idea is typically you will have something like a search and a details and an edit mask, and that's all you have. And that may make sense when you're creating business applications, because then on your screen you want one thing. But if we look at the reality today with single page websites and things like that, so anything that's supposed to look cool, you're not going to have a spa. You're going to have an introduction text, then you're going to have an image slider, so that's your first application. Then you're going to have your customer quotes, that's your second application. Then you're going to have another block, and then you're going to have the image slider again. And then you're going to have a Google map, that's your fourth application. So we don't have one application per page, at least not if we want to create cool pages. So assuming that that is the only thing running on your page is very, very risky. And it's going to break at one point or another. So Angular.js by default assumes it is the one and only application on a screen, but it's smart enough to let us take over and tell it that it is not so. So if you rely on the automatic initialization of Angular.js, that's not going to cut it. So basically, when we do all this kind of stuff, for example, you would be missing all the hosting environment specials. And let me show you how we're doing it in 2Sexy. Because if you'll notice, all it does here in our app, for example, all it says is, look, this is an app, and this is the ID, and that's it. And you saw all the code already, and it never mentions anything about DNN. So where we're doing this is on first initialization, where we say we could have multiple apps, we could have other frameworks running as well, and we need to configure $HTTP to do all these things for us. And let me find the unminified code here. And this is what we're doing. We're basically, we wrote our own bootstrap thing. So if you say I want to use Angular the nice way, but I don't want to use 2Sexy, fine. Just look at this code and adapt it to yourself. The main thing that we're doing is we are actually dynamically creating. So if you don't understand this, don't worry. One day you will need it and you will understand it. We're dynamically creating an app, and we're adding dependencies like the DNN service framework or the necessary headers into this. And we are also adding an Angular initialization, which, for example, reconfigures the $HTTP for you. To do everything. And that's it. Now, if you don't understand this, don't worry. Just try it out, and as long as you're just going to put it in a 2Sexy wrapper, it's just going to work anyways. And one day when you say, I want to take it out, I want to do something different for whatever reason, then just look at this and duplicate it. This allows us to easily run multiple apps on the same screen. So I'll just add another one here. So let me say this is the feedback form here. So I have two feedback forms. Let me just move this to a left pane. And this one I should be able to drag over here. So I have two forms here. This is number 1, and I will send it. And this is number 2, and I will send it, and it works. But this does require some nice bootstrapping, which you can just use from what we did. So that was that. I'm trying to keep scheduling in my view here, but it's okay. So either use your own bootstrapping or just use ours. Very simple, trivial, it'll work. Now, dependency injection. Who in here uses dependency injection server side? Now seriously, who uses it? You, of course, and a handful. Okay. Most people think it's too complicated or not necessary or something like that. But whenever you want to build something that actually will scale at some point or other, you're going to have to learn this. And the core concept is that if one thing needs something else, you don't pass it in manually anymore. It takes care of itself. But yes, it does take a few hours to work your way into it, but it's worth it. So when things depend on each other, for example, we need the module ID for our system to work. The request would not work without the module ID. Then the cheap way is to just pass it in through function calls. And then that would mean the very first object has to give it to the next object, and it gives it to the next object because they all don't need it, but at the very bottom, we're going to need that information, right? So we're just going to pass it through all the time. And that sucks. It breaks very easily. And the more it grows, you suddenly have very simple functions that have 8 parameters, not because they need it, but because something underneath will need it. And that's the moment you have to tell yourself it's time to look at dependency injection. So the old way was to pass it through, and the easy way is Angular takes care of all that for you. Just to show you what this means, for example, if I look at my feedback controller here, that's the code which is in charge. Or here, the new controller. The new controller just says I have something called categories SVC and a feedback SVC, but there is no code ever which actually places it there. Angular just does it automatically because it knows there is a service with that name. I'll give it to the code and it takes care of itself. And that's one thing you will have to learn a little bit, because if you don't understand that principle, you will create very nasty code which will be very hard to maintain. Yes, it uses basically, it's really going to match the spelling of this to something in the background. It is case sensitive, yes, yes. And who of you have heard of Angular annotation? The point is, the spelling is important because that's how it knows which object it has to get. But if you would minify this code, the spelling gets broken, right? So there's ways around it. But if you want to do that, better ask me first, because you'll probably waste a lot of time otherwise. So, $HTTP, that's what I was saying. Don't pass parameters around, because every system should just be able to rely on the fact that they get the right $HTTP. They should not have to worry about it. So in summary, start small, keep your concerns separated. Do not use the $scope. Unless you really have to, but there's only about 3 cases where you ever need to do that. And then here's this guy called John Papa, and on GitHub he has a set of best practices. It's a community project to really define how to do things. A lot of the things I just showed you are from him. So if you want to really get into this, look at his best practices. There's so many things which feel trivial at first, but if you do it that way, you'll start to write nicer code. One simple example is to write things like this. So in other words, repeat the function name again after the word function. Even though I'd already have it here, I have something here. It sounds trivial, but in the debugger it has consequences. So if you just learn a little bit of code styling to do it the nice way, according to his best practices, you'll be good to go. Remember that we have multiple applications per page. We're not in a SPA environment. And yeah, keep everything separated and keep going. So questions?
Quick question. Perhaps you can explain how you launch the HTML from the ASCX file, because the module is a user control.
Yeah.
So how is that connected with that?
Okay, that's a that's a standard functionality in Too Sexy Content. So basically, in here you define different kind of views. Those are either razor views or token views. So actually, the things that DNN is going to build into the next version have been available for 2-3 years now. It's just one level deeper. Yeah. So in the background, these are just all configured. And you can also say that if a certain path comes in, that it will switch to a different view for that dialog, things like that. Yeah, but that's handled by Too Sexy. Yeah.
In the context of DNN, earlier you said not to use specific variables from DNN into the, like for example, the portal ID.
Yep.
And we do use it a lot when we create modules.
Yep.
And I guess you do as well.
The point is that if you do use it, then put it into a dependency when bootstrapping. Don't try to access DNN variables from inside your application.
From inside Angularjs.
Yeah. So if you insert it into, prepare it as a constant or something when initializing the application, then you have the information, but you're not working against DNN objects, which you never said I depend on.
No, I got it. Okay.
Yeah. And that also helps that you don't have to pass things around, or that you have to just randomly say, oh, please get me the global DNN variable. You know, that's the thing. You want to look at the code and you want to see what happens. And all these hidden, oh, actually, I'm using something else as well. They're just going to cause trouble someday. Also in testing and everything, if you have the portal ID inserted in the beginning of the application, you can run tests against it. But if you assume you have a running DNN which supplies the value for you, it's impossible to test. Yeah. Yes?
Is there a Drupal extension as well?
Sorry, no. Okay, anything else? Okay, so I hope you loved it. In 1 hour, I'm going to be holding a session about taking websites completely offline. That is things like you can create very cool websites in DNN, and I'm going to go into airplane mode now. And I have a button on my home screen, and I click it, and I see a fully functioning app, and I can click on it, and I can interact with it, and I can even look at pictures with light boxes, and I can say, oh, what's the venue like? And I can click on that, and it just works, and I'm completely offline, and it'll save you, for almost all things, a lot of development time, because you don't have to do this kind of thing in Xamarin or anything. It's very simple to do. And I'll show you that in 1 hour. So I hope you liked it. Thank you for watching.